an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering the Immortal Great Souls series, Bastion chapter 64 through 66. I almost said the Bastion series, but that's not. That's the wrong way around. In these chapters, well, that marinating technique actually worked. I hope nobody ever finds out about this, because I have a feeling the toads are going to get the shit end. This is the shit I'm worried about here. Oh, also, Scorio manages to level up. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. I am having such a good time reading this. Just FYI, this book is just hitting the right balance for me of explaining the magic, explaining the fight scenes, and having a lot of dialogue and character development, so I don't get too overwhelmed in any particular section. And I've come to really realize, the more books I read, especially for the show where I slow down and talk about what works and what doesn't for me, I've just really come to realize how glazed over I can get when an author info dumps too much at once about anything in particular. It's not even I don't want to hear about the fight. I don't want to hear about how the magic works. I do, but I don't need the depth of explanation in that regard that some people do enjoy. I'm not trying to say that my preference is the correct way to write. I'm just saying that for me, I respond much more to character development and dialogue. I want the other stuff to fit together and make sense, but a lot of fantasy writing is extremely heavy on the world building stuff, and I completely understand the appeal of getting really into that as the writer, and I even could see that there's certain types of readers that would really gravitate toward that. But for me, I don't really need all that much info, as long as you are really kind of selling me on what is happening and what I do need to know, and making it feel like there is a wider world with just mentions of stuff. You don't have to get too in depth. So anyway, I am just really every time that I realize I don't have a recording the next day and that I have to stop listening now and I'm not going to get to record for a couple days, I start to get real irritated, the way that I did with Cradle, where I just I basically start listening to the next chapters of this before I have even started my next recording of the night, in the in-between times where I'm editing this episode and I'm, going and getting a drink and running to the bathroom and then come back and start the second one. I got my AirPods in my ears listening to the next chapters at that time. And then I have to stop and record on something else, and I'm always just God damn it. Sorry, Ms. T is in the chat laughing at me. Dan says Imperial Ghost Toad's secret marinating technique is the greatest name anything has ever been named. Yeah, I'm a real big fan of everything to do with this toad. Eugene, my guy. All right. So, Ms. T. Dan asks Ms. T, did you finish Rascor yet, Ms. T? And Ms. T says, you bet, couldn't stop once I hit the redacted. Oh, you little tease. You guys out here just talking about it right in front of me. Right in front of my podcast. And Dan has commissioned Rascor Plains. So I think there's going to be about a month break between when I end this book and when I start Rascor Plains. And that will be agonizing. But once it started, I'm just, recording every time that I have a recording day. So it'll be I'll be moving through it quickly like I did with this book. I just keep being surprised at how long this book is, too. It's like quite deep, and I don't know if the next book is even longer, but I feel like, Dan, it was 19 episodes to cover the next book. I think this one was like slightly shorter, but I might be wrong. So anyway, okay. Dan, redacted is half the reason I commissioned this series. You guys are so mean. You are so mean. Okay, let's talk about 64. This starts right after the advancement to Tombspark of Jova Spike, which has rendered it really, for Scorio, he's like, I could still advance and it won't matter. Like, it's just not, it's game over, you know? But he's still kind of just gotta keep pushing because he can't help himself. If there's one thing Scorio ain't, it's a quitter. That's just not how he do. Me? I'm a quitter. I really am. And like, I don't really feel bad about that most of the time. Most of the time I'm like, no, I was right to quit that. And I put my energy into like better things and I'm much happier now. But there are times where I am just like, it would be cool if you could just finish anything. Like, you know, some of my resin projects I've got going over here, things like that. Anyway, so there's a weird conversation here where Leonis says, because Scorio is like, I'm sure Praximar wishes I would disappear. Leonis says maybe he likes being antagonized and driven to distraction. And Scorio says, oh, I thought he was a sadist. Turns out he's a masochist. And Leonis says, you know the old adage? The masochist says, hurt me, and the sadist says no. I haven't heard that one, but that's really funny. That one got me. You saying I should stop upsetting Praximar? Nothing would make him more upset. What would he do with all his time? And I just really like the idea of Scorio becoming like this model student who is so by the book and respectful and careful that there's nothing Praximar can do. But Scorio has a temper problem, and I think it would be all too easy to just, you know. So they talk a little bit about what it takes to reach Tombspark, and the density of your heart is changed because you're supposed to sort of compress it back into its original size after it gets enlarged by moving into Emberling. And Lianshi says that it takes a sort of understanding of yourself that a lot of people have difficulty with. And this is really reminding me of advancing to Underlord and Cradle, where you need to like really nail what you are motivated by and be really honest about the fact that you practice the sacred arts because of XYZ. And a lot of people go into that question and they have this like answer that's very much what they've been telling themselves. You know, like, I practice the sacred arts for the honor of my family. I practice the sacred arts to improve myself. All of this sort of like really sort of noble or family-oriented, lineage-oriented language. But a lot of people wind up finding out that the real reason they practice the sacred arts is actually, I feel bad about myself and I'm trying to make up for that in some way. Or I'm trying to make a certain person proud of me, and realizing like how much influence that person has over your life. It can be kind of embarrassing to realize that you're trying to make somebody proud of you, and that's what's been driving you this whole time. Like, you know, there's just a lot about it that it can come from a place of trauma, because that's so much of what forms us as when we are children. We zero in on certain things that feel like danger, that consistently feel like danger for us, and we begin to develop coping mechanisms for them. And it is really hard when you get old enough to like quite zero in on what those coping mechanisms are and what is just like a common sense way to live your life. And it's one of the reasons why therapy can be so helpful, because we tell ourselves that like, yeah, this coping mechanism is totally normal. Everybody does this. And then you talk to a professional who's like, they don't. They really don't. I explicitly talk to people about their coping mechanisms for a living, and this is weird. This is not good. But we really not only tell ourselves it's normal, we surround ourselves with other people who have similar experiences, and that normalizes it even further. It's like somebody who drinks a lot, only having friends who also drink really heavily. You're not going to want to be around people who barely drink, because that will point out your problem, that you are drinking way too much. So you put people around you to make it feel like you're doing something normal, because they're even worse than you. At least you don't drink like Jim. You know, like, yeah, sure, I drink more than Dan, but I'm not like Jim. And this is sort of how we are with our behaviors as well. We bring people around ourselves who have the same types of boundaries, the same value systems, and we insulate in this bubble that, you know, really early on, that we have to work to dismantle as we get older and understand, like, no, all of this is like a behavior and a series of choices that I'm consistently making repeatedly that don't help. They don't serve me. And just because other people might be making those same bad choices doesn't mean it's not a bad choice. Anyway, I just think this is so, like, one of my favorite things about Cradle is when the Underlord revelations begin to happen and people are understanding themselves and really like shaken. And I am so looking forward to that with our friends here. I really, really cannot wait to find out what their sort of revelation is. And the key being, you can't just have that revelation. You have to actually accept and do a thing. So like Leonis says, I know it's bad for me to drink copious amounts of flay wine the night before an important fight. I know I should spend that time working on my forms instead. But the knowledge isn't enough. I still indulge in my many glorious vices. I haven't tomb sparked my way from knowing to being, or what have you. And it was sort of interesting because, like, the way he's saying from knowing to being is like, what he seems to be suggesting is, I know this thing about myself and I can be aware there's a better choice, but I haven't gotten to a point where I'm actually making that better choice. And I'm not really sure if that's what he meant. Like, that, what it sounds like to me is like, until I start to prioritize training, and really like get my priorities straight, then I won't advance. But I think what he was kind of saying, and I may be wrong about this, is like, until I admit that I keep choosing to have a good time over doing what would actually improve my performance, and I see for real that I value that over this and admit that to myself, then I'm never really going to like get to where I need to be, because I don't want to acknowledge what this pattern of behavior means about me. So I may be wrong, but it felt like he was starting to go down a certain road with his explanation. And then he went like a little left from the way I was understanding Lianchi's description of it. So anyway, Lianchi says that's the hard part. Though apparently Jova managed just fine. Guess she's been doing her homework. And Scorio is like, it's weird. I just thought she was sort of running in place. And Leonis rightfully is like, you see how hard she trains. What do you mean? And Scorio admits like, yeah, I guess even though she worked so hard, I still saw her as like a stationary target, I think is the way he words it. And when it's so accepted that certain people, like that there's a certain level of advancement that's likely going to be out of the realm of possibility for you at this particular point in your education, it's understandable that she gets to Emberling and he just thinks that's as far as she's going to get because that's as far as most people get. And I get it, you know, like I understand where he's. So then Leon, she tries to comfort them here with a description of the way that they work together as a team. Her and Scorio and Leonis and Naomi, she points out, compared to the team likely that Jova is going to wind up with. And she's like, they don't have practice working with each other. And there's also going to be like people that have these egos and sort of resentments and don't want to like take instruction. And then she mentions about like the fact that some of them are able to like cover certain portions of what you need for good defense and offense. And yet there's not really anybody, I think she says like that can do real range attacks. I'm trying to find the spot where she describes exactly the differences here. Oh my God. I forgot that, because Scorio gets really mad as she keeps trying to like push this point. But yeah, the overall thesis behind what she's saying here is essentially we work together like moving parts made in the same place for the same machine. This is a massive advantage. Even if we are not as individually powerful, you can have people who are super powerful, and if they don't work well together, then good luck, you know? And it's so interesting because I can't decide how crucial that can be. Like, what I'm thinking of, and this is sort of a weird comparison to make, but like, I'm watching One Piece, covering that for those who don't know. And, there are two characters, Zoro and Sanji, who are such intense fighters. Anytime that you have like a problem that needs to be dealt with, like with physical violence, it's going to be those two and Luffy that are like at the front. And yet Sanji and Zoro really do not like each other. And there will be whole sections where they are supposed to be fighting this one villain, and they get into it with each other and start to argue and forget that they're in a fight with somebody else. And that's what I keep thinking of here, is like that kind of dynamic is what she seems to be expecting. And she also believes that like Jova doesn't like other people. She doesn't open up. She isn't really good at working with others. People want to be friends with her because of her power, and they circle around her because of the promise of maybe getting something out of it. But it's not like Jova works well with others. She does what she wants to do, and probably even on a team that is going to still be the case. I hope she's right. I don't know. And then there comes a point where like Leonchi and Leonis are joking around, and Leonis calls her the leader, and she says, "I'm not, that Scorio." And Scorio says, "I am not." And they look at him and he's like, I'm just the most desperate, so I come up with crazy shit and you guys just like do it. And Leonchi's like, "Oh, good. So a desperate leader. Even better." And there is an interesting mention here. I was glad that this was like spoken about, because you guys remember in the last episode that I was sort of like, what even was going on there? Leonis is like, it was really wild during that fight. The way that, was it Ravenna? Is that the name of the girl that she just fought? But he was like, she really got freaked out in a way that I have never seen her, and I wouldn't have believed she would let anybody witness. And Leonchi says maybe Jova Spike's Tomb Spark power is fear-based, which is awful. That, like, that would make a ton of sense. It didn't occur to me in the like during the fight or while I was discussing it later, obviously, which is funny because that is a thing. That's not a super rare power for somebody to weaponize fear. Like, that's something we've seen before. It's in the Cradle series, for God's sake, that I always talk about. But yeah, in that moment, I didn't feel it. So I didn't suspect it. I think that the way that they're fighting and in this sort of like other dimension, weirdly, it makes sense. The audience isn't going to have that reaction. But usually when a character uses something like that in text, you're watching them do that from the perspective of somebody who is also feeling the result of whatever they're doing. Even if they're not the target, it will be a sort of like a presence, a feeling that spills over into folks who are not directly involved. And so, yeah, I just didn't really think about the fact that if something was going to be merely almost like psychological, that the audience would have no inkling of that, which I think is like a really scary power, because part of the thing in this competition and the way people work is that they're trying to keep shit under wraps and not let each other know what they can do fully a lot of the time. And that way they've got a little something in their pocket. But when you keep pushing it with people and you eventually do have to show your hand and do the thing, except in a case like this, nobody will really be aware. Like, Ravenna may tell people and then eventually the word gets out. I don't know. It may be that you have a kind of power, though, that the person doesn't even realize what is being done to them as it happens. So maybe they don't tell anybody because they don't realize that that was you. And that is a really intense ability to just have and folks not be prepared for and know about it all. Anyway, okay, so eventually weeks pass. And Scorio is advancing, but he is just not really seeing. This is so sad to read because, like, I get how single-minded and fixated he is on a particular goal. But every step of the way that brings him forward, because he has not yet reached the goal, he doesn't see the worth in it. And this is very relatable. You know, as somebody who myself wants instant results, I am so impatient, and I can have all kinds of evidence that things are going in the right direction. But if I'm not getting like the particular result I'm looking for, then I act like it doesn't matter. Like, you know, doing this thing with my fitness and starting to run again. And then I'm going to be starting this weightlifting thing this weekend. Part of me, the goal is to lose weight because my weight is actually affecting my body at this point, and it's pressing on nerves and making it difficult to breathe at night. And now I have a CPAP machine, things like that. Losing weight would actually materially help with those things. Also, though, you can't get away from the fact that there's like an aesthetic aspect to it. I also want to look a certain way. And so I'm doing this fitness thing. I'm getting feedback from my Apple Watch and from my sleep apps that my heart rate at rest has gone down 22 points. That's a lot. That's significant. And that my sleep scores have gone up like 200 points a night minimum. I am at a much better, like, restful dip when I'm asleep. These are all very material, data-driven improvements in health. But because I haven't dropped the weight that I want to drop, I'm acting like nothing's happening. And it's just so short-sighted and single-minded and ignorant in a way, you know? So what I'm saying, Scorio, is that you have these little steps are what get you there, dude. I understand. But you're acting like you're not changing anything. And this is all going toward where you want to go. I understand it's not as fast as you want, but guess what? You know, fucking, like, just stop it. I will say, though, despite the fact that he's focused on the wrong thing, again, he ain't no quitter. So it's not making him feel like he just wants to quit. He's never in that headspace where I would probably be. You know what I'm saying? He's frustrated and pissed and constantly sort of thinking over his personal, like, resentments about the way the school works. Totally valid, by the way. But he never is just like, what's the point? Which I definitely have a tendency to do, and it's not great. So, what's worse, focusing on the wrong thing or just giving up? Like, I would say giving up, probably. So he's continuing to grow the black star flowers, and Lianxi, despite not wanting him to do this marinating technique, is like, just set it aside and not talked about it. The two of them are still training together, and things seem mostly normal, but it does get brought up eventually, and this is the spot. This is the spot where she is talking about how not a team. There are some glaring weaknesses in their lineup, not much by way of actual mobility. The more Corrigan uses his technique, the greater a threat he becomes to his teammates. What is that about? Do we know what his, I don't remember what his weapon is and how that works, what she's describing here. And she says, and think about the chambers like the balancing floor or what we've dealt with in the old gauntlet. How would they fare then? Scorio says, the cubes would be no problem. And she says, sure, but what about the scrolling wall? Being invulnerable to most damage won't save you from falling into an abyss. Corrigan could grab her, help her climb. True, but my point is this. They're all excellent at fighting. That's what the tournament rewarded, the ability to go toe-to-toe. But neither Chloe nor Zala are especially mobile, and none of them have worked together as a team to compensate for each other's weaknesses. To which Scorio is like, they've got time still to train together, so it may be a moot point. They wind up learning how to function as a team. So this is when our friends go back out into the ruins, and they're going through the different wards, and they have a real intense energy about them that is getting people out of their way. And a woman who's basically on a soapbox gets their attention. And it takes a little while before Scorio finally recognizes her as Nissa, who I'm so glad that he explains who that is, because I will tell you what, her name didn't even ring the faintest of bells for me. I completely, this is the person that I think was watching him maybe when Lianxi, clocked it. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Because it was somebody that Lianxi was people are beginning to, take notice of you. But yeah, this woman is making a speech about how the academy is bullshit. None of this helps us. They keep making prophecies that turn out to be nothing. And then when they don't come true, they don't even have the decency to come up with a second prophecy. They just leave us hanging. Our city got basically decimated, and it was going on for a minute before anybody fought back. And that, I was they mobilized really quickly, actually. But I think that the fact that they all got frozen by Imogen, maybe they don't know that part, or, as she points out, they can't protect us against power like that, which she's not wrong. They wind up having to call in somebody else because the people at the academy aren't up for it. And it does sort of seem like the point of, we can't stay here because the mana isn't dense enough. We have to go into other realms. To get to the level of power you would need to reach that point, you are then forced to abandon the people that you are trying to help, or allegedly were supposed to help. And they are left with lower level people, and you've got random Imperators just out there, evidently able to come back and wreak havoc. That it just, the system, the way that's set up, does feel like that's counterintuitive, and she points out about family members that she lost. And I was not sure because she got out clearly, so she's living out here. I'm assuming that she went back to her family and that this isn't some made up thing that's just for the point of the speech. And Lianchi is like, we should tell people at the academy. And Scorio is just like, no. This is... And I really loved this. Just let her, I don't know, be part of this revolution. If anyone has reason to be upset, it's her. You're not making sense, Scorio. She whipped that crowd into a mob. If she's a great soul, then there's no telling how dangerous that could get. I know, it's just that what happened to me, it's the same thing that happened to her. It wasn't fair. And I just want her to have a chance, you know? If the revolution gets crushed, she can be crushed with it. But the thought of handing her over to Praximar to be thrown back through the final door for another 100 lives is just... I can't take on that responsibility. And they eventually nod, but it really doesn't feel like they fully get where he's coming from here. And eventually, like, Leonis is like, Praximar says he's invited community leaders to attend the tournament celebrations, and the houses are spending money on repairs for the city. And Scorio says, he says that, but I've not seen anything like that out there. And since none of the other students ever leave the graveyards, how would anyone know better? And I didn't, like, yeah, you could just say, if people... That's the thing about not being involved with your community, about being, like, set up in a whole different area, provided with a whole different level of living. You can just trust somebody saying, oh, we're helping them. But if you're not feet on the ground knowing this yourself, and let's be honest, they probably don't care that much. Like, that's kind of what this sort of thing ends up coming down to, is they don't really want to know. As long as they're being told it's handled, and that makes them feel virtuous and like they're not part of a rotten system, that's good enough. So Lianchi says, but they have to know this anger is out there. They have to know that people are upset. Sure, said Scorio. The question is, do they care? They might if they knew a red lister was riling them up, said Lianchi quietly, but Scorio scowled and marched on. Lianchi, I absolutely could not believe that Scorio didn't call her out on this. Like, really, girl? You're just like, yeah, but she's a red lister. Hello? Are you not... You are only giving Scorio this chance because you went through the gauntlet with him. But Nissa, if you had gone through the gauntlet with her and she was feeling this way, would you feel any... Like, this is nothing different than what Scorio has said himself. It's just he is taking part in the system because he is more power hungry than she is. And that's purely what I think is, like, he has figured out a way to make things work in the ruins, accidentally got noticed. This wasn't part of his plan, but since he can be rescued by the system, he'll take advantage of that for now. And she just wasn't afforded that same kind of opportunity. That's literally all that's really different. If he were still in this position he had been in, where he's living in the ruins and not allowed into the academy, I can't say that he wouldn't be standing by her side. Like, if he hadn't reconnected with his friends from the academy and he perceived himself as being abandoned by them, yeah, I don't know, man. Anyway, they're heading to his little garden area, and there's a weird feeling that only Lianchi and Leonis as Emberlings are seeming to perceive. And they feel the ground beginning to rumble, and then Nox appears, like, from behind them. He is out of the ground, yelling for them. There's a cushy willow eating black stars. But then when the ground really starts to shake, Leonis is like, that's the cushy willow? And Nox says, no, that's much worse. Alban worm, come for mana, flee, favorite friends, flee. Bless him. Oh, he's doing his best. So, later on, I will point out, Naomi is like, dude, you could have just staggered their production so it didn't become this massive bait. Did you even think of that? And Scorio's like, no. And it was sort of funny because, like, I have just started gardening for the first time in my life. And I was reading stuff about the way that people stagger plantings. And it blew my mind. Like, this never occurred to me. But of course, you know, it's just, that's the way you make sure you don't get a massive crop of the same thing all at once. And then it all goes bad because you can't eat it all. So I really appreciated that he has the same sort of, like, impatience. Again, just plant everything. I just want it all as fast as I can. Fucking on brand, man. So Lianshi, as she hears, like, what this is and they feel this thing coming, she is saying, we need to get the fuck out of here. And Scorio is absolutely not hearing her. Like, just, no, we have to save the plants. And as he is about to run into the burrow, Leonis stops him with a hand on his shoulder, and Scorio starts to have a really extreme reaction to this because he just thinks it's meant to be like, no, you're not going in there. But when he turns and sees the expression on Leonis's face, he realizes Leonis has spotted something he hasn't noticed yet. And he turns and we get this fucking worm that we have heard about already before. Ew. I am really curious, you guys, if these things living in these ruins used to be people sometimes. This thing may just have a weirdly humanoid aspect to it. But what if it was a person at some point? What if these were all people? Is this a result of the ruins, like the blight doing something to people who live in a certain place? Like, I don't like it. So, of course, that when they see this, they're like, no, really, we need to go. And then here comes Naomi, and she tells Scorio, go save your plants. I'll hold it off. And for a second, Scorio's like, yeah, that could work. And then he really looks at this worm that she's about to fight, and he's like, no, this isn't going to happen. There's no way. And he chooses to let go of the flowers because he wants to make sure his friend is okay. And when he says later, of course he would choose that, are you high? It genuinely seems to shock her. She really, because this woman just has not believed that the friendships between them were real. And she knows how bad he wants this. So for him to just being like, no, it's not worth it, in the face of her imminent demise, is like pretty much the most absolute evidence that you could ask for. It doesn't get more decisive than that. And yeah, this is when we also get to see Leonis use Nazar for the first time. This is so cool. The runes blazed into life, so bright they left luminous trails seared in the air behind them, and the blunt tip of the hexagonal club impacted the side of the Alban worm's head, which exploded away under the blow like a burst bladder. And then, you guys, a great cloud of fluid and soft, pale flesh streamed into the air. Fluid. As the worm keened and wheeled about, orienting on Leonis as he fell into a crouch beyond it. Just as Scorio reached its base, his leap was much less impressive. He swung on it, weight combined, causing the nightmare lady to tear free of its flexible mouth, crash down to the ground. Scorio sensed the mana in the air begin to shift as if invisible storm clouds were forming. But even as he rose to his feet, he felt a burst of confidence. They could do this. Together, united, they could pummel the worm into submission. Run. Scorio frowned. Was she telling him to leave because he was a cinder, because he was weak, or... A great cone of shimmering light formed around them all, with the worm at its center. It was like being trapped in a cyclone of heat haze, one that encapsulated most of the square. Immediately, Scorio felt the storm cloud sensation of the mana begin to quicken. Damn it! We need to kill it now! That's what we're trying to do! Scorio shouted back. What's it doing? Killing us! Snarled the Nightmare Lady. What could he do? Where was Lianchi? There, she'd worked her way behind the worm, was looking as frustrated as he felt. The coal mana was whirling faster and faster, but now it was changing, heating up, growing toxic, like actual clouds of superheated soot. It was becoming hard to breathe, and he felt his skin begin to burn. The Alban worm whipped aside, undulating with preternatural speed, and hit the Nightmare Lady with its tail, catching her mid-leap. This thing is so fast, like, it's just deeply unfair whenever something is gigantic, but also really fast. So he yells, Lianchi, run to me, I'll be the bait. And he, like, basically waves and is like, come and get me, come and get me. So... he drew forth his chalk and raked a line in the stone before him. The tongue slammed into the sudden wall of force, but just before the worm could react, Lianchi dove in, spearing forward as if into a pool, and threw herself right into its mouth. The Alban worm jerked back in surprise, then snapped back its tongue and closed its mouth, the lower jaw rolling up to seal Lianchi inside. The worm froze, the soft flesh of its head and neck working, undulating as if 1,000 rollers were trying to compress Lianchi. Trying to, and failing. And in that moment of surprise, of confusion, Leonis darted around the shield, leaped up, and brought Nazar down upon the Alban worm's head with all his strength. The club blazed to life a moment before it collapsed the human visage and clove through the rest of the upper torso like a booted foot kicking a huge mushroom apart. I really love that imagery. I really, really do. So it spits her out, and the storm collapses. With a burbling gargle, the Alban worm fled across the square, weaving drunkenly, and then dove back into its tunnel. A flash of its tail, and it was gone. This thing is so gross. It's so gross. You guys. There was an even worse moment, and I feel like I jumped past it, where she cuts the worm, and there's like, sort of, here it is. Naomi slices it. Each cut caused milky white fluid to burst forward, followed by a thicker, more clotted substance like curds or rancid cheese. Absolutely fucking not. No, thank you. Mr. Tucker, I implore you. You just had this beast have cottage cheese for blood. Could you just not, please? Please? Oh, my God. So anyway, this is when we know for sure his plants are gone. And Scorio has a teeny tiny nervous breakdown. I've seen that the current parlance in younger generations for describing a mental breakdown is a mentee bee. So he's having a little mentee bee right now. And again, we have Lianchi calling them all idiots repeatedly, just lashing out at the fact that what they did was irrational. I could have held it back. And they're all just like, you absolutely could not. You were literally in its mouth. Like, you know, and she's saying that she watched over all of them, but she's like saying it as if it's totally a normal thing she was doing and not something that signifies that she actually cares about friendship or any, you know. There was never any contest, he said, raising his chin and meeting her gaze squarely. Not in my mind. I'd lose those plants 1,000 times over before I left you alone in a fight like that. Naomi's eyes widened and she took a step back. Same, said Leonis, though technically they weren't my flowers, and I'm really not all that into flowers in the first place, outside of table decorations. And Leonci tries to reach out, says, like, we've missed you, and she backs up again and just is like, you were so loud going through the ruins, I was able to avoid you really easily. Scorio thanks her again. It was an idiot plan. Did you think all that mana wouldn't draw the greatest predators around? She just can't help it. She has to lash out. She does not know how to, like, just accept what they're saying to her. So, finally, when it comes down to telling her exactly what Scorio's plan was, she has a similar reaction to Leonci. But when she sees Scorio being like, look, I was just going to give it a shot. Now I'll never know, but I do appreciate you. And then all of a sudden she says, you can have the sapphire vials. And I really I love the fact that the author earlier was like, he thought she would that she would accept his apology and be friends again, or even give him the sapphire vials. And he doesn't have it happen then, but it still happens. It's just in a very different circumstance. And I like that, because if she had given it to him after their fight and had accepted his apology, it would almost feel like he was being rewarded for being shitty and then copping to it, which, like, that's really just bare minimum behavior. But here, he was willing to give up something that he really wanted more than anything to save her life. And he has made a point that she can't help but acknowledge. And this is how she acknowledges it. Not by being vulnerable, not by being like, I guess you guys really are my friends, but by giving him something incredibly valuable and basically yelling at him to take it when he starts to, like, kind of argue about it. You need them to make Flame Vault. Well, maybe I don't, all right? But why not? This time her glare had enough force behind it, he thought her eyes nearly burned sulfurous green. Do you want it or not? If you don't, just tell me and I'll go ahead and keep them after all. So he agrees to take them. And they have to track Nox down in order to get to this fluid that he's going to be marinating in. I adore the fact that Nox tries to be like, well, how are you going to pay me for my amazing chum at defending the flowers if the flowers are gone? And Leonci has to be like, bruh, the point was that you were going to be successful in doing that. The flowers are gone. You ain't getting paid for that. That's not what we made a deal on. And he's trying to be clever here, but eventually he's just like, yeah, all right, fine. So Scorio strips. I think it's so funny the way that this is described. With quick, efficient movements, he undid his belt, dropped his pants, peeled off his socks, and moved to the edge of the pool. I don't know why. The dropped his pants, peeled off his socks. It's so, like, workmanlike. It just sounds... It sounds like he's wearing also kind of a different outfit than what I was imagining. I'm imagining the socks he's pulling off being, like, white tube socks that go up to, like, mid-calf. But, and also, I just want, for the record, dudes out there, if you're about to get laid, fucking don't take your pants and underwear off and leave your socks on. It is extremely unappealing. Take your socks off too. The socks only, there is something, it's not good. It's not a good look. So I just wanted to tell you about that in case. So this dude, he drops down into the pool. And we find out that it's got, like, some psychotropic properties. I can't remember if that's been mentioned before, but if it has been, I just forgot about it. And he feels his skin starting to tingle, but it's not, like, unpleasant. And he's just swishing around, and then he's like, all right, guys, here I go. And he dunks. Now, I am not going to get too into the feel of this as he's in here. It goes on for a little while longer than I really needed it to be honest. But he is really starting to feel great. At first, he's just like, oh, God. Oh, it's like I'm meditating without any effort, which is really for me giving stoned. Like, as somebody who didn't try weed until much later in life than the average person, the first time that I ever got truly stoned was when I was like 34. And it was like a revelation for me. I couldn't believe the kind of anxiety that I'm always carrying around until I got something in my system to remove the anxiety. And I suddenly was like, oh my God, it could be like this. And it's just, there's just a real sort of humbling moment of being like, wow, I am fucked up, you know? So he is feeling all of this mana coming to him, and eventually he starts to like try and ignite, and it is getting harder and harder. Nox had been using the words missing and falling in ways that didn't make sense given Scorio's heart. The only way Scorio could pull in mana was to direct it into his heart, as when he saturated it before igniting. The goal was to force ever more mana into himself, straining to maximize his saturation point until he could barely ignite. But once he'd ignited, he could no longer saturate, only increase the rate of burning. Or was that true? So he feels like this gel is making it actually possible for him to have more control than he might otherwise have. Scorio focused completely on the inside of his heart, became his heart, identified himself with it, felt the pull as a visceral experience. There, just as it entered his heart, he could split it, send the requisite silver to keep the burning going, and then pool the rest around the flame, refilling his reservoir. For a long, aching moment, Scorio just watched as the coal mana both fueled his burning heart and began to saturate it at the same time. It was a terrible balancing act, one that he'd never have been able to pull off without the gel. But then something else happened. And it starts to get more and more difficult, and the mana is getting dense. The layer of coal was nearly all gone. His heart burned on, the flames subtle and constant, and always his reservoir filled, growing ever denser, ever larger. So here's my question. Did he just get to Emberling, or is this him sort of being able to fast forward into Tombspark with this density thing? Because it feels similar to what is described. I guess he can't, though. There's no revelation here. There's no, like, insight moment. So it has to be just Emberling. But it feels like he's already starting on the stuff he needs to do for Tombspark. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, so he eventually... It's so wild the way this goes. More mana is pouring into him than he can handle, and he starts to scream. His vision was doubling. Now he felt his real heart stuttering, losing its beat. He was burning up, his heart growing as it swelled before him, eclipsing everything else. The flames reaching up to the heavens themselves, his reservoir an endless lake of depthless night with an azure core. His body was thrashing, flailing at the gel. He was drinking it in, could no longer tell which way was up, which down. His mind was fracturing, his very sense of self tearing apart. Then it all fell away. And he's just standing on this platform with all these doors. And he's like, oh shit. Okay, here we go. So he goes through this portal after passing the other doors that lead to other levels, essentially, of advancement. And he does, of course, sort of think to himself, is it possible for me to just, like, bash one of those down? And then realizes, like, I'm sure that's not how that works at all. So he steps through the light and enters a version of himself that is standing in the city square watching his brother about to be hanged. And this is like a much smaller segment of time and memory than I had even guessed they got for Emberling. I really thought he'd be working with more than this. And it's such a small, you know what I'm saying? It's really surprising how little information we really get here when you step back and look at it. So he's looking at his brother who's had the shit beat out of him by the guards, clearly. And there's this rage that's already here as he steps into this version of himself. And I love that initially he feels that and is like, oh my God, why am I so mad? And has to sort of piece that together. So Kurgan, it turns out, is the one here dealing with his fucking brother, the guy making like the announcement about it and about to perform this execution, which that's some fucking baggage to have with a person. Jesus Christ. So he's looking at his brother and it's very clear that he's like thinking about doing something crazy. And there is a guy who is yelling at him, don't you fucking do anything. Your brother knows what he's doing and that he has to die. This has to happen. And he's not like somebody saying, you can't affect the past. This is only a vision, Scorio. No, this is a dude who is clearly involved in whatever movement Scorio is involved with. And this is just underscoring what I think about Scorio's past and why he's been red listed. And I think it makes sense that the other person who's been thrown into those that place has been red listed as well, and also turning into a revolutionary. Like it all goes together. But yeah, this dude is just telling him to be patient and restrain himself. Ibero played a strong hand and failed, but you stand to inherit the fruits of his labor. He would not want all his work to go for naught. If you can find the strength to resist temptation, you can step into his place. Rouse the provinces, foment a true rebellion. You will be followed, but squander your strength here, and the king shall turn his baleful stare full on us. And Scorio is like, it seems kind of trying to listen to him. Like, it doesn't seem like he's even angry at this suggestion. It's like he knows the guy is probably correct, but it doesn't ultimately matter because he just can't stop himself. So this is when Kurgan begins his speech. May this execution serve as a warning to all who desire to challenge the king's unassailable authority. And I'm wondering who the king is. And I just feel like it's Praximar, even though that doesn't make any sense. But it's just because they're apparently rebelling against an authority figure. And that, in our current story, is Praximar. So it's just who it feels like it is. So, Scorio, exert yourself. Control the crowd. Draw back. Ibero must be sacrificed for the greater cause. His martyrdom will fan the flames of revolution. And Scorio feels that the whole crowd is like in the palm of his hand. That they are looking to him for any sign on how to behave here. And he makes eye contact with his brother, who has an expression of just like, this is happening, dude. And I'm okay with it. You know, this is what we knew might happen. From here, the flames will spread, he thought he heard. From here, the revolution will grow. My life was an attempt to play the game by their rules, to earn votes and pass laws in local councils. My death will show the world the sham that this public forum truly is. My death will turn me into a martyr, turn the indifferent into fanatics, and you shall lead them, little brother. Now lower your eyes. Don't watch me dance. Pray for me, and then avenge me. Let my end be your beginning. And the fact that he hears him, I'm like, is this an actual real connection? Is this a speech that he was told earlier? Like, that he's remembering? The way he says, now lower your eyes, feels like it's being told to him in this moment, that there is some sort of mental connection. But I can't tell how much this is sort of symbolic or, I don't know. So his brother watched him. His brother, his elder, who'd sheltered him under his raised protective arm, who'd taught him honesty, righteousness, fairness, and a deep and unforgiving intolerance of tyranny. I go now. Could he truly hear his brother's words, or was he imagining them, creating the words based on what he knew his brother must be thinking? No matter. So he's like, yeah, all I need to do is just let these people kill my fucking brother. I can't do that. I'm not doing that. And the man next to him is just like, you are going to squander everything we did. We aren't ready for this, and you're about to throw it all away. And Scorio is just like, tough. Oh, well. And honestly, this is one of those things that's like, I can't decide because I don't have the context for it, On the one hand, I'm like, asking him to do this is so unfair. And then on the other hand, I'm like, but if there is a particular goal that you've all been working towards, it does suck that he can't prioritize that for the sake of all of you. Scorio screams, people of Spurn Harbor, we save our own. And he ran forward, cresting through the crowd, shoving his way. But resistance was melting even as he met it. The crowd bellowed with one voice, a massive howl of fury that perfectly captured his own. And like a levee bursting, they pushed forward as one into the line of soldiers. And I love this. Kurgan is so excited to fight. Like, as soon as they do this, he's just like, yes! He clearly just wanted to fuck some people up. And Ibero drops. The trapdoor opens, and it looks like he's just going to die. And Scorio manages to reach forward and slice the rope. And his brother drops and is okay. I really thought he was just going to die anyway. And he may die shortly, But as he reaches out, it says, Scorio felt his heritage, his power, his birthright erupt within him. His right arm flung forth to reach for his brother, changed. Black scales burst from his skin, swept around his forearm, and burnished his hands, as his fingertips turned into wicked claws, easily 6 inches long. His whole body was changing, compacting, layering with denser muscle, thick, heavy scales covering his shoulders, sweeping up his shins to send huge horned spikes out from his knees, out of his elbows. And the power! It was delirium-inducing. The bonds of the earth seemed to lessen, paling before his might, and with a roar that shook the air, he leaped, exploded up and forward, bounding through the air as if hurled from a trebuchet, up and over the crowd toward the gallows, sailed through the air, and as he flew, his claws glowed with heat, their bases cherry red, their tips pure white. That sounds so dope. It really does. And this is what he looks like on the cover. So, like, I had predicted that this was going to be the form he wound up taking, but it just sounds even cooler on the page to me than it does in the illustration. And Scorio gets a challenge from Kurgan, and they leap up together. It's so frustrating. He leaped, leaving the gallows to hurl himself at Kurgan, his claws swinging at the armored man even as Kurgan's body began to change, even as he swung his axe to meet him midair. High above the crowd, they met, the force titanic, and Scorio had the briefest glimpse of the knight's axe skittering off his scaled left arm, even as his right buried itself into the huge breastplate, which parted like butter before the white-hot claws. Word. And then he wakes up. Again, it's just such a short moment, really. It feels like it's longer because of having to get the description all in there. But like from beginning to end, if you were watching this flashback, I feel like it would have taken like 4 minutes, you know? And then he's back, and that's all the context that he gets, and he doesn't know, like, you know, what anything further here. Oh my God. The thing with his brother too, like, he's alive at the end of this vision, but I don't know that that's how this continued. And he says his birthright erupted. Does his brother also have abilities like this? Curious about that. And he's just like, and how did I go from this to what I was named as a red lister? But he doesn't have any further information. And when he comes back to himself, his friends are like, hey, I'm really sorry. I know that whatever you've dealt with just now sucked. And Leontius especially is just like, I grieve for that old pain. I'm so sorry. Naomi points out that this is her first life, that she had no trial. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, that like, I didn't realize that the trial was only going to be for people who have had previous lives. I thought that it was going to be that you got to see some of your previous life for your trial because you are, that helps you in whatever progression mentally you need to make. And that if you don't have previous lives to draw from, it would simply take a different form for you. But she didn't have one at all. And I just thought that was really interesting and surprising. And I don't really understand exactly how this is constitutes a trial, because it felt as if what was happening was simply him watching something in a memory. But if it's a trial, that means that he had some choice that he could have made. And I don't know if this is supposed to be sort of like a defining moment in his life. And it's like, are you going to do the thing you are supposed to do that's the truest to you? What does failing this look like? How did that even, how would that even work? I don't know. So anyway, he manages to manifest these claw things on one hand. And Leonis is like, that's badass. Naomi is like, one hand? I mean, that's cool, but like, that's not going to be. And then he does a second hand, and she's like, oh, okay, that's better. And then it starts to go all the way up his forearms, down his shoulders, down his back. His robes faded away, disappearing into mist, so he was left wearing only an ornate metal belt that held up layered black cloth that hung to his knees. Look, I'm not saying that this is a terrible look. I'm saying it feels really impractical that he's wearing a long loincloth in this form. I feel like you could have just scaled him all over, or shorts, probably. It just feels, all I think is just like you kick somebody and you're flashing everyone in the room. Maybe there's a sort of underwear under that. I don't know. It's not mentioned, so I think no. But anyway, Lianshi is very impressed with this once he is able to show this off. And he's also taller, I think. It says maybe an extra 6 inches. Yeah, here it is, 6 inches of height and another 6 inches of reach, not counting his claws. Impressive, Naomi said, rising to her feet. Let's see what you can do. I'll be in the old gauntlet. And Leonti's like, dude, and Naomi's like, I don't care. Fair? Who gives a shit about fair? Let's go. And she goes in there, and Leonti tries to be like, dude, you don't have to do this. But of course, Scorio is like, no, I really want to try. Definitely gotta. And the chapter ends with him just going to the tunnel, to the gauntlet, and it's saying it was time for a rematch. So I am very, very excited to see how this fight goes with this. I really don't understand this trial thing. So I'm curious about like a discussion further, you know? And also he had a brother, and how did this all work? And he was always a revolutionary, I guess. Like, this is just his jam. And I kind of love that. I love that about him. I gotta admit, this is what we want. Somebody who would just really fucking go to the mat. So, all right, I gotta wrap. I'm over time, but thank you guys again for hanging out with me. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this and commissioning the next book. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.